Anyway, thanks everyone for listening tonight to my talk. I'm going to be talking about the beautiful Kermadec petrel, or as Mick kindly came up with a name for me, the pirate petrel of Phillip Island, which made it sound way more exciting, but also true, which we'll get to soon. So I'm a project officer at Birdlife Australia, and I was lucky enough this past season to work on a project on Norfolk Island, or Phillip Island off Norfolk Island, run by the Department of Planning, Industry and Environment. So just to show you where we're talking about, there's Norfolk Island. It's about 1,500 k's off the east coast, closer to New Zealand really than Australia. That's a close up there. And Phillip Island is that little blob you can see down the bottom there. It's about 5 k's south of Norfolk. And just zooming in again to show you a bit of a crappy aerial photo there, but it really shows the erosion, and we'll see some more photos of that in a second. So a little bit of history about Norfolk and Phillip. Norfolk's got an amazing history, and I'm not going to try and cover that all. Highly recommend reading into it. A brief Polynesian settlement, or when I say brief, about 200 years. There's archaeological evidence that occurred about 800 years ago. But when Europeans arrived,
I'm gonna ask you, do you mind if I stay down here with you?
Yeah.
Because I'm setting up.
Yeah. That's cool.
2 penal settlements were established on the island. So one of them in 1788, which was then shut down not long after that, and then another when it was reactivated in 1825. And as a result of these settlements, as has happened on so many islands around the world, the sort of ecological destruction began. So rats, cats and pigs invaded Norfolk Island, all of which are really bad predators of seabirds. And on Phillip Island, goats, pigs and rabbits were all released. And so these were released on Phillip as a food source. I guess it really came to be an important thing after what is going on in this image here, which was the shipwreck of the Sirius. So this occurred during the first settlement period of Norfolk Island. Obviously a shipwreck, quite an unexpected event, but it meant another 1,000 people ended up living on Norfolk at what time was a very, very small settlement. They had to be fed somehow, and how they fed themselves was by eating all the Providence petrels. So there was once a really good population on Norfolk. It was entirely wiped out in less than 10 years. So this event really reinforced the importance of having food sources. So hence all the stock that ended up on Phillip Island. Unfortunately, this meant that a lot of birds were wiped out. So on Norfolk and Phillip, there used to be quite a lot of endemic species. And you can see there's a bit of a list there of everything that has been lost, including an endemic kaka and a wood pigeon, a ground dove, a starling, and a long-tailed triller subspecies, amongst others. And it wasn't just the endemic species, but also a lot of local seabird species were also wiped out. They didn't go extinct because they occur elsewhere, but no longer occurred on either Norfolk or Phillip. In response to this, eradication was carried out. So the goats and the pigs on Phillip, they both were sort of died out over time. There wasn't any fresh water over there, and they were shot quite often for sport and for food. But the rabbits really just kept on, which is incredible because, as you'll see soon, they completely denuded the island. So there was pretty much no vegetation at all. It looked, and it still almost does look like a desert. And the rabbits were down to eating the bark off the trees. They'd really eaten everything. So over about 10 years from the early 80s, an eradication project was implemented, and the last rabbit was shot in 1988. Unfortunately, Norfolk itself does still have rats and cats. So the seabirds have not been able to recolonise to a great extent there. This is Phillip Island. As you can see, it's still severely eroded as a result of that grazing pressure over many hundreds of years. It really does feel like a moonscape actually, or a desert in a lot of the places, especially across the top of the island where topsoil just can't develop. It's also very, very windy there, so really hard for any soil to form. As you can see down the bottom there, in some of the gullies and valleys, vegetation has re-established, and this has been helped along by the park staff who've done a really good job of planting out a lot of native vegetation. But unfortunately, weeds are an ongoing issue. So even though the weeds have helped to stabilise areas of the island, there's now massive areas that are just covered in mostly African olive amongst other weeds. And it's an ongoing issue. So just a couple more shots just to give you an idea of what it looks like. You can see those massive eroded gullies, which are just not regenerating. Some of the really steep cliff lines around the edges of the island, some slightly dodgy feeling standing that close. So Phillip is a seabird haven. So it was lucky enough never to have rats. Even though it did have the grazing pressure, it didn't have rats present. So some of the seabirds that were wiped out on Norfolk have been able to hold on Phillip, even in really small numbers. So it's pretty diverse. We've got 3 species of shearwater there. We've got the wedgie up the top, the little on the side there on the left, my favourite, super cute, and the flesh-footed, which isn't pictured. We've also got 5 species of petrel as well. Oh, 4 species, sorry. The black wing down the bottom left, really abundant. It's about 20,000 at the latest estimate of those guys, plus a gorgeous white neck up the top right there. And not pictured is the Providence, which also managed to cling on in small numbers despite being totally eaten on Norfolk. We've also got the masked booby, and we've got various species of noddies and terns as well. And of course, tropic birds, how can I forget? Another favourite. So lots and lots of different species. It's a really, really cool island. So a bit of background to the actual project. So the Kermadec petrel, the subspecies in question, is listed as vulnerable under both New South Wales and federal legislation. And it's what we call a data deficient species. So pretty much nothing at all was actually known about it in terms of its breeding biology, how it uses habitat, where it goes at sea. We really knew nothing. And that's because of the nature of its breeding sites. So in Australian territory, you have 2 breeding sites. Obviously, that's Phillip Island up the top there. And down the bottom shows Ball's Pyramid off Lord Howe. So this little bit of rock, it's about 25 k's off the coast. And you can see it's incredibly inaccessible, and the petrels actually nest up the top, sort of half of it. So not exactly a handy site to work on. And globally, the petrels are distributed on just really remote islands. So Phillip really presents the best chance of being able to intensively study their population. And that's why this was chosen as the site for the project, as I said, run by DPI in New South Wales. And it's been going since 2017, so for about 5 years of data. So it's starting to be really useful now. So even though Phillip is the most accessible breeding site, it can still be a little bit interesting to get to. So that crossing, which I showed you before, for about 5 k's of what can be extremely rough water. So I've had some very frustrating times looking across from Norfolk and just wanting to get out there and just having to be at the mercy of the sea conditions. When you can get there, we crane a boat off the wharf and make the somewhat interesting lumpy crossing, get out into a rock platform with all our gear, and then we have to hike it right up onto the top, which is a bit of an effort. But my volley here, George, didn't really want to do more than 1 trip, so he decided to do it all in one, which is not recommended, especially with some of the ropes. You've got to sort of haul yourself up, but he got there. So introducing the study species. This is the beautiful Kermadec petrel. It's a nice sort of chunky guy, medium-sized petrel. One really cool thing about it is it has lots of different colour forms. So you get anything from this beautiful dark morph down the bottom middle there, all the way through to the light morph, which is absolutely beautiful. And you get these intermediate types as well. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but I'm just pointing at stuff. Yeah, the intermediates sort of got like the white face markings and the white belly. But what is consistent across all of these different morphologies is the white primary shafts on the upper wing, which you can kind of see in that drawing on the right there. So that is something when you see them flying at sea can be quite a good distinguishing feature. And they also have quite a fairly obvious white patch under the wing as well. So one cool thing is their sound, which I'll try and play for you. Hopefully it'll work. So pretty cute, funny call, and really handy for us because just listening was one of the best ways for us to find their nest sites. So we could just walk around. They're very vocal as they come in of an evening and through the night. And often that's the way we found their nests because they just can't help themselves and they make these crazy noises. We'd also try and do the sound, which was really hard in getting them to reply. Sometimes it worked. They didn't really like my impressions though. Just briefly, their global distribution. So as I mentioned before, there's 2 subspecies, and the one that we were studying is Pterodroma neglecta, the Southwest Pacific subspecies. So as well as being on Phillip Island and Ball's Pyramid, hence the name, you get them in the Kermadec Islands, which are north of New Zealand. So once there was the world's largest population there of about 200,000 pairs on Raoul Island, but unfortunately rats, cats and goats caused the total extinction of them from that island. They do occur on islets off Raoul which haven't had rats, and hopefully now that eradication has occurred on Raoul a number of years ago, they might start to recolonise. They're also on various islands throughout the Pacific, and once you get over to the coast of South America, you get the other subspecies. Also, quite randomly, they occur on Round Island off Mauritius over here, which is quite interesting, quite a separate sort of location for them. So in terms of Phillip and Norfolk, we do have fossils showing that they were present on Norfolk originally. We also have some specimens that were collected there in the 1880s. It's possible they could have been eaten at the same time as the Providence petrels. You know, they're pretty chunky and would have been pretty substantial meal if you're a hungry, shipwrecked person or a settler. But unfortunately, even though they are now on Phillip, they can't recolonise Norfolk in the presence of rats and cats. We don't have fossil evidence that they were on Phillip originally, but there's no reason they wouldn't have been. So it's quite likely they were there before all the vegetation was denuded by those grazing herbivores. But the first modern record of them turning up was in the mid-80s. And this was by Owen Evans, who was a bit of a legendary local naturalist. And he used to spend 3 months at a time camped over on Phillip with his long-suffering wife, studying the seabirds. So a lot of the early knowledge we have about the sort of first colonisations of Phillip after the rabbit eradication comes from his work. But he only banded 15 birds in the whole 7 years that he was doing these studies. So that just shows how low those numbers were originally. This is what their nesting habitat looks like now. So they're quite colonial in their nesting habits. They tend to nest within close proximity to each other. They are surface nesters, so unlike most pterodromas, they don't burrow at all. They quite like shaded sites, so you can see them amongst boulders, under roots. They like to be under shrubs, so actually the African olive provides strangely good habitat for them, which is a bit of a management conundrum. So they like some shading, but not too enclosed. So they're quite similar in terms of life cycle to other pterodroma petrels. They're fairly monogamous. So generally they will keep the same partner between years, but not always. When they first come to the island as chicks, or after they've fledged and come back to the island after many years at sea, it can take them a few years to form a bond with a partner. They'll usually use the same nest site every year, but they can vary up to sort of tens of meters away. So generally in the same area and usually the same nest site. And one of the most interesting things about them is that they actually are present on the island all year round, with some birds breeding in summer and some breeding in winter. And again, this is a really, really unusual thing in petrels. And it's the same individuals that always breed in summer or always breed in winter. They'll only lay 1 egg each season, and they won't relay if that fails. So that 1 egg is super precious every year. Just a little graphic here to show the life cycle, which is very similar to other petrels. So they come back to the island during the breeding season, which sort of starts around October. They'll rekindle their relationship with their mate, who they find again. And after about 3 days, they both go to sea for their little honeymoon period, which is about 3 weeks. Then they'll come back, the female lays the egg, and the male will take the first incubation shift. And then they'll continue to alternate incubation shifts to about 50 days. And those shifts can be sort of up to 2 weeks long. So quite a long time to be sitting on your egg and not having a feed out at sea. So after 50 days, a little chickie hatches, and the parents guard it for only about a day before it's left alone. And they go to sea to begin the very busy job of finding food for it. So they keep feeding it until it weighs more than its parents do. And it begins to start exercising its little wings and exercising those flight muscles. Eventually, the parents will stop feeding it. And after about 2 weeks after this, when it's an average of about 90 days old, the chick's ready to fledge. And so it will take off from the island out to sea, and it won't touch land again for at least 2 years. Diet and foraging. So this is quite interesting. We don't have a great understanding of their diet. We know they feed on squid, fish, and crustaceans, all of which I got to experience being thrown up onto me on multiple occasions on handling, especially of the chicks. They do tend to throw up a little bit, which is never nice. They do feed just by seizing prey from the surface and dipping, but the most interesting thing they do is actually piracy. So this is what we call a behaviour called collective parasitism. And so this photo on the right here from Nick, which he's kindly provided, it shows the way that the Kermadecs appear to have evolved to actually mimic aggressive parasitic birds that steal food from other seabirds. So these are your Jaegers and your skewers. This photo shows an Arctic Jaeger on the left. And you can see how much that Kermadec petrel, that's a dark morph. It looks incredibly like a skewer or a Jaeger. So it's got that real squat body shape. Even its flight profile is super similar. It's got those white wing flashes. And so why would they do this? Scientists think there's sort of 2 reasons why this benefits them, looking like a skewer or a Jaeger. So firstly, those aggressive skewers and Jaegers, they won't attack one another. So by looking like one of them, they're not going to get attacked by a skewer. Hopefully it will think it's one of them. And the second thing is, by looking like one of these scary, big, aggressive birds that's coming to steal your food, other petrels are like, it's a skewer. And they're more likely to be successful because that other bird will either give up its food by regurgitation or drop its food item, and the Kermadec petrel can take it. So it's a really interesting evolutionary thing that they seem to have developed. So what were we actually doing during the monitoring? Mostly what you can see there on the right, crawling around in bushes, looking for nests. So we do this by listening to those amazing calls like I was playing before, and just searching outwards from known areas of nesting habitat, because they are quite colonial. It's the best way to find more nests. Once we found the nests, we'd mark them with little numbers and go back and visit them every trip. So trips tended to be about every 6 to 8 weeks, for about 8 days at a time on the island, and that is where we'd live for the duration of that trip in little Parks Australia field hut, which is very luxurious. So yeah, we'd follow those nests up throughout the season and see their fate. And one of the best ways to do this while we weren't present on the island was using remote cameras. So we could see dates where things happened, where chicks hatched, when eggs were laid. And if a nest failed, we could often see why that was using the remote camera footage. So this is just a couple of examples to show what you can find out from remote cameras. So this guy is incubating an egg at the moment. You can see when they had a changeover with their partner. So obviously this one's come over to take over the shift of incubation, work out those shift lengths from those remote camera images. You can see when the chickie has hatched, that's a bit of eggshell still in the nest, so we can work out the hatching date. We can see how often the chick's being fed, and we can often see even which parent it is that's coming to feed it, depending how similar their plumage was to each other. And we can also see the chick growing and work out when it actually fledges from the nest as well, when it disappears. So the next slide is a bit silly, but I just put together a bit of a GIF with some images I got from remote cameras. Backstory is those 2 nests next to each other, and the parent comes in to feed one of them and the other chick gets jealous. So it's being fed there. And the other one's like, I want some of that. And he comes in and they kind of have a bit of a battle. I just thought this was funny, but I just thought they were kind of like 2 fluffy sumo wrestlers or something. Obviously very easily amused. Anyway, it kind of puts him back in his place eventually, and he goes back into his own nest. So just some results. So birds were found breeding all year round, and their numbers are increasing, which is really good news. we're up to 43 pairs at the moment, past season. The range is expanding as well. And most importantly, the breeding success is increasing, and that's what is shown in this graph here. So I'll explain why that is, that the breeding success is increasing in a minute. So banding, we've now banded 133 adults over the 5 years of the study and 30 chicks. So as you would know, banding lets you work out exactly how old a bird is when you recapture it. You can work out how far it's moved, whether it's breeding with the same partner every year, whether it's using the same nest site every year. Yeah, lots of good stuff. You can also work out how old a bird is when it very first comes back to the island after being banded as a chick. And because this study's been going quite a few years now, we've started to see chicks coming back that were banded early on in the study. So we've had 6 come back now with an average return age of 30 months, which is quite low for petrels. So that's been an interesting finding in itself. Even one of them came back at less than 2 years of age, which was quite a surprise. We also can work out sort of how old they live. So we actually had a 30-year-old bird, which was banded by Owen Evans, that naturalist I mentioned earlier. That guy turned up last year. So that was really cool. And we don't really know how old they might live to, because other petrels are up to sort of 40 years or more. But really it's just because we haven't studied them very long. They could get even older than that. Another really important aspect of the study was tracking. So as I mentioned before, pretty much nothing was known about where these guys move when they're at sea, whether that's where they forage whilst they're feeding the chick on the island, or where they go for their post-breeding migration. So to do this, we use these little things called geolocators, and they pretty much have a little light sensor inside, and they're just attached to the bird's leg with a Velcro strap and then tied on with a bit of sailing thread to keep them extra secure. So what you do is you calibrate that device to the sunrise and sunset time where you put it on, so it knows what time and the location can be compared. And then when it's at sea, it's still detecting those light levels, and it records what time sunrise and sunset is. That gives you the latitude, and the mid time between sunrise and sunset apparently gives you the longitude, and I don't quite have my head around that. But anyway, you can work out exactly where on the planet the bird is, sort of give or take 100 kilometers or so, which might sound like a lot, but when you see how far these guys move, that's not too bad. These little devices have pretty good life. They can last for about 4 years, but the downside is you do need to catch the bird again to take the data off. And that's what's shown down at the bottom there. That's Nicholas, the project manager. He's got a data logger reader attached onto the logger, and he's getting that off. That was a bit fiddly and annoying. So we started actually just taking one logger off and putting another one on straight away, and that was a lot easier. So we've still got 58 loggers out at the moment. So lots of really good data has been collected on movements. So this is a bit messy looking, but this is just a combined map to show sort of the movement range of a lot of the different birds so far. This is pretty preliminary results. So the concentration that's more like around Norfolk Island there is where the birds will be foraging while they have a chick. So they're not going as far, sort of between New Zealand and New Caledonia mostly. But when they finish breeding and they're ready for their migration, that's when we see these long tracks that head out past PNG. This guy went up to the Philippines, and this guy went all the way to Japan. This is just one individual, so you can see it a bit easier. Again, that concentration is the breeding season where he's foraging for their chick, and then post-breeding heads all the way up to Japan. This shows the same bird but over multiple years, and you can just see the consistency of its migratory route, which is really interesting. So each colour is a different year. So some really cool data coming through. So there's still quite a few threats facing Kermadec petrels, well, both past and present. So predation, that's still a risk on numerous islands where they occur. So unfortunately on Norfolk, we still have those cats and rats present. That's still a big issue on Pitcairn as well, which is another breeding site where almost total breeding failure occurs every year. In the past, we had pigs on Phillip, which are predators of seabirds. And interestingly, tala birds, or the purple swamp hen, are actually a huge predation risk on Phillip as well. And I'll talk about that a bit more in a second. Erosion and habitat loss is obviously a big threat. They don't have any vegetation to nest under. And we've seen that on Phillip as well as elsewhere on islands of Chile, where rabbits and goats were also present, and the birds are just trying to nest with no shade at all. It's really not ideal. So these purple swamp hens were quite a surprise. They are technically a native species. They self-introduced from New Zealand to Norfolk. So that was natural. However, Norfolk Island is very, very cleared now for agriculture, and that's created quite an ideal environment for the purple swamp hen. So they've just bred up into big numbers, and then they've flown across to Phillip and found lots of tasty seabird snacks. So being surface nesters, these guys are just sitting right out in the open, and the tala birds would just walk right up and have an egg or a chick as a meal. And we've used remote cameras here to prove that this was happening. The predation was actually so high that about 75% of nests were being lost. But Parks Australia has done a really good job of controlling these birds. So they've had shooting programs in place for about the last 4 years. And we've actually seen predation drop to about 40%. Great population increase in Kermadec. So we've had the highest number of nests ever, actually, this past summer. And nest losses are right down. So it's a good news story, you know, to do something about it. Another few simple little solutions here to improving breeding success have been trialled. So making these cute little alcoves, a bit of artificial habitat, hasn't been super successful, probably because there is quite a bit of good natural habitat, but it could be useful in other areas that have been more denuded. Another simple solution is just putting these branches in front of really open nests, and that sort of just blocks the view of those tala birds from being able to get in and eat the chicks. And that's been a really easy, good solution too. So to sum up, they're really, really interesting petrel, quite weird. Lots of cool facts about them. So that highly variable plumage is very unusual. The variable breeding times within the same location is also super weird. So in other breeding sites for the same species, you might get them breeding in summer on one island, in winter on another island. But on Phillip, they seem to be breeding at all different times within the same island, which is really interesting. Probably warrants some future study as well. They seem to get divorced a bit more often than other petrel species, and to be a bit less loyal to their nesting sites, which is kind of interesting in itself, breaking the mold there. And the juveniles come back really early too, which is quite interesting. So the study is ongoing. It has another year at least of funding. Hopefully this will allow more of the winter breeders to be studied, because they are in lower numbers, the winter breeders. So we don't have as many tracks for them, for example. In the future, another thing that they want to do is to track the fledglings when they leave the island, because we don't know where they go at this stage. It'll also be interesting to see what happens now that Lord Howe has had a rat eradication. So possibly the birds that are on Ball's Pyramid off the coast might come and establish on the mainland of Lord Howe, although this might need a bit of help along the way. So sound attraction systems and potentially some habitat augmentation as well. On Phillip, it's going to be really important to continue the purple swamp hen management. So that shooting is going to be an ongoing thing that's going to need to happen. And also carefully considering weed management. So even though we don't want African olive taking over the whole island, it is a really important structure for the Kermadecs to nest under. So trying to balance those two things is quite tricky. And just to finish off, a little bonus visitor that arrived just in time for my last trip, which was really exciting. So my volunteer and I were out one night. We just heard this really strange call coming from under a bush, which I'll play now. I was like, what is that? That's not a Kermadec call. So we were luckily able to grab the bird from under the bush, and it just felt weird. It was quite small and sort of skinnier feeling than a Kermadec, and it weighed a lot less. And we took measurements and photographs, and we suspected it might be a herald petrel. And well, I can't say for sure yet because it's still sitting with bark at the moment for approval, but we're pretty confident that that's what it is. So that was really interesting. So never been recorded before on Norfolk or Phillip, and actually in Australian territory, the only places it's really been is its one breeding site in Australian territory on Rain Island off North Queensland, and then one record, I think from the 80s from Cocos. So pretty exciting to find it here, especially on land and appearing like it was prospecting for a nest site. So it was sitting under this bush for 2 days in a row, which is pretty cool. It is it has a range across the Pacific on various islands, so it's not totally out of the question that it could be prospecting for a new nesting site here. We're just interesting to see what happens in the future if more of them turn up, because they can actually hybridize with Kermadecs too on some of their other breeding islands. So who knows, maybe we'll see a new hybrid colony established in the future. Just wanted to thank Nicholas Carlisle, whose project this is, for letting me present on some of his results. Huge thanks also to Luke for collecting data during his PhD on the side on Kermadecs, my volunteers George and Jen, all of the National Park staff on Norfolk, especially Nigel, Mel and Joel, and thanks also to Charter Marine for safely transporting us across what could be a slightly frightening channel. So thanks everyone. Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, well, I'll jump in and thank you first before we open up to questions, Emily. So, yeah, a fascinating talk, especially for those of us that love seabirds. So, yeah, really, really, really good. And I also want to apologise for failing to introduce you before the talk, Emily. So that's embarrassing. Sorry about that. But we will be obviously giving you an HBOC mug. So I won't make my usual joke about the mug. I'll leave it at that. We'll give you the mug obviously in due course. So yeah, just thanks again on behalf of the club for your presentation tonight. And yeah, as you said, questions. Let's open them up. But round of applause for Emily first. Silent round of applause because everyone's on mute. We've got a few questions in the chat, so I'll read out the questions for you, okay, and then we'll go to the floor. So yes, there's one from Ben Ellis in there asking, do you know if the same breeding pairs are habitually returning to Phillip to breed, or are they potentially using multiple islands in their distribution over their life cycle?
Oh, hi Ben, thanks for tuning in.
He is there, so
that's a good question. So no, like most or all petrels, they're very, very loyal to their breeding sites. So they do use the same island, and even, as I was saying, the same exact nesting site every year. And I guess we know this even more so through the tracking, because we can see that those birds are coming back with regularity to use the same site every year. Yeah, so they do seem to have that really strong pull back to their natal island.
Okay. Matea has asked, are there any patterns in which birds breed in one season versus the other? And do the pale morph birds practice piracy as frequently and successfully as the dark morphs?
Oh, they're really good questions. Yeah. So in terms of morphs, there doesn't seem to be any patterns in breeding. So all the morphs just seem to interbreed with each other randomly. And that's sort of been seen in other breeding sites as well. In terms of other patterns, I guess, in those breeding seasons, there's less of them, less pairs that breed in winter compared to summer. But they're quite consistent in whether they are a summer or a winter breeder, with I think one exception where a pair was a summer breeder, had a year off, and then came back and bred at a different time of year, and then came back and bred at that same time of year again. So maybe there's a little bit of flexibility there, but overall they stick to their season, it seems. The question about piracy is really good. So I also wondered that. And there hasn't been a lot of research into that, but the sort of one main paper that's looked at it has found that surprisingly the light morphs seem to be as successful as the dark morphs in pirating off other birds, which seems a bit odd. Yeah, I don't know if they still probably have the same flight profile, so that same sort of skewer body shape potentially helps them.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's just been one real study, and it was sort of purely observational from a boat. So I reckon there's probably warrants a bit more
Nick's
study.
champing at the bit here.
Oh yeah, let's let Nick talk.
I was just going to say that the Jaegers are just as polymorphic as the Kermadec petrels, so I don't think it really matters what the appearance of a Kermadec petrel would be, because at any given time there's going to be polymorph Jaegers hunting other birds, and I think that in any phase of plumage, a Kermadec petrel is going to succeed with piracy. And the paper that you mentioned then, I think it was something like 4,100 observations. So it's a pretty reasonable data set, and I think you're right. Yeah, I don't think there's any bias towards the morphs. Yeah, but I think they do it just as successfully with polymorphs. Yeah.
Oh,
That makes sense.
that's all the questions that are in the chat. So yeah, Alan, looks like Alan's about to ask something.
Follow-up question, is there any other species that also practice that piracy, like the Kermadec does?
That might be another question for Mick. But as far as I know, I don't.
No, not in
other
the form, like not in petrels as far as I'm aware. Simon, I don't know, I don't think so. Which
I'm aware of.
No, which like it's too much of a coincidence that the Kermadec petrel is the only petrel that has white flashes in the underwing and that is so polymorphic, exactly like Jaegers. It's an amazing evolutionary thing. It's just incredible, I think.
Pretty amazing.
Okay. People can continue to ask questions in the chat, and I'll read them out if they're shy about speaking up. But elsewise, either turn your mute off and shout out, or wave your hand about, or whatever. And if you've got questions, then let's hear them. Oh, of course you have. Mick's got a question if no one jumps in soon.
I'm really interested in about the young birds. Like, do Kermadec petrels, are they sexually mature at a younger age? Do we know that, or they just returning to the islands to hang out? Like?
Yeah, I don't think we know that yet because we've only just started to see returns. So that'll be something that'll come up in the next couple of years. So one of the birds, though, that I did see return, when was that? Maybe December or January, as a young bird. So that bird would have been around a bit less than 2 to 2 years old. I saw it courting with another bird. So at least they're trying. I don't know. It will probably take them a few years to actually form a bond, but it'll be really interesting to see at what year they actually do start successfully breeding. Yeah.
Amazing.
Was that an intentional stick up of your hand earlier there, Ben? I saw you put the symbol up.
Oh, I just wanted to give other people a chance. I kind of feel bad because I'm sneaking into a HBOC meeting, but if I can ask a question, another one.
Good.
That interseasonality between adults coming back to the island, do you think there's any chance it could be that there's just limited breeding refuges there for the birds, or is there just kind of refuge aplenty, and that really wouldn't sort of apply to specific birds wanting to get a spot, thus having to maybe wait till winter before those spots become available?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. I don't think that's the case, especially because they are still in relatively low numbers compared to the habitat that's available. And they also don't tend to overlap in the nest sites they use. There are a few nest sites that get used in both winter and summer, but because the breeding cycle is also quite long, those summer and winter breeders can sort of overlap in the time that they're on the island. So no, I don't think that's the case, but yeah, it's hard to say. It does seem like there's still vacant niches though that they could come and use if they wanted to.
Cheers.
I got another question, if I may.
Absolutely. There's no one else waiting, so off you go, Alan.
So this is it kind of relates to your Herald Petrel records, Emily, which you got my vote for that as a
Exactly.
But Tom and I found the Pycroft's Petrel on Broughton Island as well, and it was there for a couple of days. It kind of like, what should our expectations be when there's this sort of unusual seabird in a breeding spot for, what should we expect in the future,
Ooh,
in your opinion?
good question. Well, I guess it's going to depend on if any other ones also manage to find the island. So I guess when you're just seeing one, you just kind of go, was this just incidental that it's come across this island? Or, yeah, it's hard to say. I guess I'd want to see another one before I got too excited. But it does suggest potentially that they're expecting, so potentially, they're doing well on their breeding islands and they're able to start expanding and looking for new places to colonize. But yeah, I don't want to get too excited and say we're going to see a second Australian breeding site, but it would be nice. Well, yeah, we'll just have to keep an eye out and see what happens. Sorry, that wasn't the answer you wanted.
I think it's just exciting. Sorry, Alan. Yeah, off you go.
No, I was just inviting comment, really.
Yeah, I'll say it's exciting that with all this recent pest eradication work that we're seeing, and we are, some of the seabirds are one of the few good news stories in conservation, and maybe we will start to see more of this stuff.
The New Zealand and New Caledonian storm petrels are great examples of that, aren't they?
Absolutely. So yeah, it is exciting.
I think it's really interesting that of all the petrels to turn up on Phillip, it's a Herald, and they've been recorded hybridising in the Indian Ocean. So I think there's maybe something in that. The comment.
Yeah, that's right. Well, maybe we don't have to wait for more heralds to turn up because they could just start breeding with the Kermadec. That is true. I just see Leslie's got a question there in the chat. Thanks so much for tuning in, Leslie. Yeah, that's a really good question about whether the parents, the season the parents hatch affects. Oh, so when the chick, hang on. So you're saying when the chick hatched, does it come back in the same season to breed? I have to look at the data because that's a really good question. We've only got 6 that have come back, but I actually don't know off the top of my head if they came back at the same time that they hatched. That will be super interesting. And I guess because we don't have any of those chicks yet breeding, you probably can't quite answer that. But yeah, will give us a good idea, at least if they're coming back at that time of year. That might be when they decide to breed. But yeah, I'm going to go and look that up. So thanks for that question.
No, I just sort of thought that it could be a possibility that, just say, the parent birds actually hatched out in summer and they then go on to breed in summer, where the ones that actually hatch out in the winter then continue on to breed in the winter.
Yeah.
I just sort of thought that may be a reason.
Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me considering how much else they seem to remember. They can, remember exactly how to get back to their breeding island and how to get back to their exact site where they hatched. It wouldn't be surprising at all if they also remembered the season. Thank you.
Is Phillip Island the only place where they're found year round? I may have missed that.
No, I don't know. I'm not exactly across all of the islands, but one interesting thing was, so in the Kermadec Islands, on Raoul, I believe that they were almost entirely summer breeder, and then on some of the other islands of the Kermadecs, they're entirely winter breeders. So even like within an group of islands, it was like it seemed to be more restricted to different islands. So that was quite weird. And who knows what the explanation is for that. Yeah, but I don't know for sure. I think on the islands off Chile, they also breed year round. So it's not just a Phillip Island thing, but it does seem to be variable across their range. Very weird.
It's such a fascinating bird, I reckon.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's such a fascinating species to have had the privilege to be involved in researching it. Very lucky.
Yeah, totally lucky. They're really, really cool bird.
Great experience.
Can I just ask one, like the ones that only breed in summer, cannot interbreed with the ones that only breed in winter. So are we looking at potentially like a split of two different species, or you know, how does it work? Or are there some that break the rules?
Well, as I mentioned before, there has been at least one pair that changed seasons, so
Okay.
they obviously can do it, but it does seem they mainly stick to their season. So yeah, that is actually a really good point, actually. Yeah, whether we start to see differences, you know, genetically between species that breed in winter versus summer. But I guess the other thing is there's not like a cut-off, like there's not two distinctive periods. It is sort of like a gradation of time. So like the peak summer breed is sort of like November egg laying, but you know, eggs are laid all the way through to May. So there's not just two clusters. It's sort of a spectrum, I guess. Yeah.
There's a couple more questions popped up in the chat if you wanted to take a peek at those, Emily.
Yeah, cool. Got one from Liam there. Are the colour morphs evenly distributed in the population? No, the light morphs seem to be quite rare. I have only seen a couple of them really throughout the study. I couldn't tell you which is more common of the intermediates or the darks, but probably the intermediates I would say maybe are a bit more abundant than the darks. But yeah, the lights seem to be a bit lower. So I have no idea what the causes of that would be, but they all do interbreed with each other. And then Matea's asked if the nesting habitat changes between winter and summer. No, they seem to use the same habitat types. I guess the reason for that is also the subtropical climate. It's a bit more consistent as well in its temperatures and rainfall. So I guess there wouldn't be any seasonal real reason for that to change. And oh yeah, Liz, could summer and winter breeders have different food preferences related to seasonal differences in different prey species? That is a really good question, actually, especially because when they're foraging is a bit more sort of concentrated to the area around the island itself. It's quite possible that you could see differences depending on the sea surface temperatures and whatever else was going on at sea. Yeah, it's a really good point. I'm not sure if that's something that has been considered, but yeah, good.
Well, maybe the kleptoparasitism explains that. Maybe that's why they're able to be a year-round breeder, is the fact that they're getting their food from boobies and other birds that are there all the time.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Nick, actually.
There's some fascinating questions coming out.
Yeah, I know. I'm going to have to like write these down.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Any more to be researching?
Yeah, that's it. Thanks, everyone.